Welcome to History and Politics Chat at 4 o'clock on whatever day of the week this is. I'm going to go with Tuesday. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. I hope that you are getting this. I've got no strain on my end at all, so you should be. I don't understand why it seems to be locking. But in any case, so you have a lot of questions today, and I want to cover a lot of territory. And they're in a number. The questions are coming from a number of different places. So I hope to tie them all together at the end. But let me start here with a question sent in to my email, actually, by Hamilton White and Mary White. And they point out that I have never talked about the 17th Amendment. Which sounds a little funny, honestly, I admit, but I've never talked about the 17th Amendment and the push lately on the part of some conservatives to get rid of the 17th Amendment. And the 17th Amendment is the one that provides for the direct election of senators as opposed to having your state legislatures pick the senators, as happened until the passage of the 17th. And I wanted to hone in on that question because it's a really interesting question, because it's not just about the Senate. And it's not just about the Constitution. It really encompasses a lot of the debates that are going on nowadays, although it really is tangential to them. This is not an active debate in the same sense that many of the other debates I'll be talking about today are active, but certainly it is on some radar screens. So I'm sorry, I'm a little bit disconcerted because my screens are frozen and jumping in 5-second intervals. And yet there are 4,000 of you who appear to be watching already. So I'm assuming that this is working. But I'm kind of trying to watch the screens at the same time. All right, so the 17th, the whole reason we got the 17th Amendment was quite simply because the Senate in the late 19th century was quite literally owned by the corporations. I mean, literally, a senator would say, I'm the senator for the Jute Trust, or I'm the senator for the Sugar Trust. And the idea was that the Senate really quite literally was a representation for corporations. And when that happened, there was this big push to stop that from happening and to make sure that the people once again had control over their senators. And the simple fact of the matter was that it was really easy to buy a legislature. So if you wanted, for example, to have your senator be the senator for the Jute Trust, oh, thank you, whoever just told me that. Says the feed is fine. It's just frozen on my end, I guess. They quite literally would simply go to a state legislature and think about, I mean, maybe not if you're in California or New York or Texas or Florida, but if you're like me in the state of Maine, and I mean to cast no aspersions on any particular senators or or any particular state legislatures, but you know, it's way cheap to buy up the legislature for, I'm making this up, Nebraska in 1890 because, you know, they're cheap, frankly. And so when that happens, there's this move among people to take the naming of the senators away from the legislatures, which are being bought up by corporations, and give it back to the people. All right, so why are people now talking about changing that system? And this is actually the larger picture that I wanted to get to. There is an argument. There is an intellectual argument for why people want to get rid of the 17th Amendment. And the reason for that, and these are people on the right, they want to get rid of it because they are interested in refocusing the centerpiece of our government on the states. And what they're saying is that by returning the naming of the senators to state legislatures, it reinforces the power of state governments as opposed to the federal government. Now, I'm not suggesting, I disagree with this, so I'm going to lay out this here as an intellectual argument and say, to me, I don't understand why that is more representative of a state than the actual people voting for the senator. But anyway, but the argument that you want to have the states be the centerpiece of our federal system is central to where we are right now in American history. And here's the reason this matters. And it comes out of World War II and out of the legislation that comes after it. So during the New Deal in the 1930s under Democratic President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and after that with Truman, first as a Democrat, and then after Truman with Eisenhower, who's a Republican, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's a Republican, what those presidents do is they change our government in such a way that it begins to regulate business. You hear me say this so much, I could say this in my sleep. Regulate business. We have federal regulation, really powerful federal regulation of business for the first time in our history. Not entirely. There's been regulation of business before that, but this is really robust, and there's real protection of labor. There's a basic social safety net, and I mean a basic social safety net. So, for example, we're going to have the creation of Social Security in this period, and we're going to have hang on a second, my notes went away. Now they're back. And we're going to have, some of the basic social safety systems we have, but we're not going to get, for example, some of the later things that we're going to get after World War II, the food supports, for example, and things like that. But we're going to have a basic social safety net. And we're going to have the promotion of infrastructure beginning with FDR. And with FDR, who does things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is an attempt to really create a national corporation that brings this region of the country that has been behind the other regions up to the equivalent of other regions of the country. And we're going to do other corporations as well. But we're going to have an investment in infrastructure. And after FDR and Truman especially really focus on the economic recovery of those years and using the federal government to protect the economic recovery, then so we've got a nationalization of that. Then we have under Eisenhower. Eisenhower is a Republican, and this is really going to matter because he looks at the use of the federal government to protect the economic equality around the country. And when I say equality there, I want to be really careful because although theoretically, in many ways, here are those caveats there, that this economic recovery and this economic support was supposed to exist for all Americans, all American men, really, it really does discriminate against people of color. But Eisenhower, and it has to do that because for FDR, because FDR's got to get it through Congress, and the Democrats in Congress include the Southern Democrats, who at the time are complete segregationists. That's going to switch later on, of course, in the 1960s. But so after FDR and Truman, then Eisenhower gets into the game, and he says, hey, we need to use the federal government to promote civil rights as well. And so under Eisenhower, we get Earl Warren as the head of the Supreme Court, and then under Nixon, we're going to get Warren Burger at the head of the Supreme Court. And what they're going to do is really important for this whole argument about whether the heart of America is the federal government or the state governments. So what they do is they say, hey, we got ourselves a real problem, because if you look around this country, and it's not just only them, people like Thurgood Marshall, the reason he's important early on is because he applies this theory to a number of state decisions. But at the national level, under Earl Warren, what Warren does is he says, okay, we got a real problem because we have states that are deliberately discriminating against Black and brown people in housing, in marriage, in schooling. They've created this second tier of Americans under state law. So how do we at the Supreme Court protect that? How do we protect American individuals from state discrimination? And what they do is they take the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, the Reconstruction Amendment from 1868, and as I keep trying to demonstrate, they reach through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment and the equal protection of the laws in that amendment. And they reach back and they grab the original 10 amendments to the Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and they pull them forward and they say, okay, when the framers wrote the Bill of Rights, the framers wrote them to apply to the federal government. But we're also going to apply them to the state governments. All right, so what you have coming out of the New Deal and out of the Warren Court and later the Burger Court is the idea that the federal government is going to protect civil rights and workers' rights, and later on by the Warren Burger Court, women's rights, in the states. Okay, that's really, 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 oh my gosh, really important. Because what you are seeing from that and now is an attempt of people to get rid of that, to go back to returning power to the states to write whatever laws they want in terms of civil rights, based in ability and gender and race and ethnicity, and voting rights. All right, so when people talk about wanting to get rid of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution because they want to recenter the center of our government in the states, this is a much larger project to get rid of the federal government protection of workers' rights and civil rights and return that the centerpiece of our government to the states, where a majority of voters can, for example, decide that Black people shouldn't vote, or that that women shouldn't have reproductive rights. That they're trying to return those decisions, which have become federal decisions, to the states. Now, I'm going to give you some homework here because I actually think that's a real problem, but I am not somebody who believes personally, and I don't, you should make your own decisions about these things. That's the whole point of a democracy, right? The whole idea of concentrating all of our power, though, to me doesn't make sense either, because if you have traveled around this country, you know, for example, that what is a living wage in, let me pick on a different state here, in Oklahoma, wouldn't get you a park bench in San Francisco. And so there are definitely different issues in our federal system that don't speak well to having national control over everything. But the question is how we marry those two things together in such a way that we do have civil rights and we do have protections for workers and we do have business regulation without becoming so central that all you have to do is take over the central government and everything else falls with it. And that, in a way, is the beauty of our system, but it's also the danger and the stress of our system as well. And that actually brings up another issue that I completely forgot what I was going to tell you about with that whole idea of the states versus the federal government. Maybe I'll remember it again. But so the whole point here of playing around the idea of the 17th Amendment and what people are trying to do there is this idea of returning forces to the states. And of course, part of that is that once again, you could simply buy up the senators, because it's much easier to buy the state legislatures than it is to buy a national election or a statewide election of the people. Much easier to bribe the 40 people in the legislature than to bribe the 400,000 people casting a vote. So that's what was really going on behind that. And now it's killing me that I can't remember the other thing I was going to tell you about. All right, so there we go with that. Pat Hirsch had asked about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and that is one of the ways I was hoping to pull that in, was the idea of the Bill of Rights there being moved forward and applied. Oh, that's the other thing I was going to say, is that to me, intellectually, there's a huge problem with this idea of returning everything to the states, because unless you couple that with universal suffrage, well, then all you have to do is gain control of the state legislature, and you can become a dictator. You can basically become a minority dictatorship, which is precisely what we have in places like Wisconsin right now. And so if the Supreme Court then says, well, that's what the voters want, that's what they voted, well, fine. Except they cut a whole bunch of voters out of the system. So to me, you can't uncouple those two things. If you want to put those two things back together and then argue for the states being the centerpiece, that's great. But I don't see how you can uncouple them myself, at least intellectually. I want to come back to those issues. It is freaking me out a little bit. I can't see any comments, so I can't see where any of you are on this. All right, so here's another question that somebody asked that I think is an excellent one. Kathy Monahan Ryle, by the way, and Ryle, Kathy, if you're listening, is a very old name around here. It's a first name, and if you ever care, I will tell you a story about a man named Ryle Harold and why he was important in my life, or at least in the lives of people who were important to me. She asked, what I think is a terrific question for me in any case. And she said, no, I'm not going to say she said this. I have said that I have been really very impressed with the Biden administration, much more impressed than I expected to be frank. And I am often trying to be quite high on Biden because I feel like it's kind of weird how everybody loves to talk about negative stuff and nobody dares really seemingly to talk about positive stuff. And there's a lot of really positive stuff going on. I mean, think about the fact that we have vaccines and that they're in people's arms. I mean, if you had told me last December that I would be fully vaccinated by May, I would have been like, I would have started crying because I would not have believed it was possible. I actually saw my children two of my children the other day. I mean, this is huge. And it's like, oh yeah, we're vaccinating more people. It's like, this is a really big deal. So I try and really emphasize those things because I feel like it's kind of weird how everyone's all like, well, this is miserable and this is miserable. Well, yeah, lots of bad stuff goes on, but there's really good stuff too. So anyway, she said that somebody asked Kathy didn't ask me this. Somebody said to me, you seem to like Biden a lot. Why don't you tell me what you don't like about Biden? And there's two things that make me uncomfortable, although I understand how we've gotten there. And then Kathy asked, tell me about Afghanistan. By the way, once again, everybody sounds smarter than I do when I'm reading what they say because I mess it up as I read it. She says, I'm conflicted about Biden withdrawing the troops. I'd love not to be there, but I'm really worried about what's going to happen, especially as there are attacks on the girls. And I'm afraid for the Afghan people, especially the girls and women. And isn't this going to help terror groups rebound and rebuild? Can you help me understand this? And I will do the best I can on that because in answer to the previous question, what am I nervous about? I hate to say it, and I totally get why we're pulling out of Afghanistan. I really do. And I get that, and I think I can explain why that's the case. But let's not pretend there's not going to be a cost to that. And it bothers me that cost is going to be borne largely by women and girls. So that bothers me a lot, like keeps me up at night. But that being said, let me explain how we got here. And I'm not going to go into the whole history of the Afghan war, the war in Afghanistan, which I believe I've written about. If I haven't, I've talked about it somewhere recently because I know I've done a ton of research on it. But Biden's in what my mother would have called a mel of a hess because Trump, as you know, wanted before the election to keep his promise that he would stop overseas wars, which are not popular. But rather than actually having a real deal to make that happen, this is the way that transpired. So it was a weird agreement that we had, first of all, in terms of getting the troops out of Afghanistan under Trump. So what happened is, first of all, when Trump's people went to negotiate removing American troops from Afghanistan, they didn't negotiate with the government of Afghanistan, with the Afghan government. And the American troops are there at the invitation of the Afghan government. But Trump's people didn't negotiate with them. They actually negotiated. They left them out of the negotiations, and they negotiated instead with the Taliban. And the reason that the Taliban is on our radar screen is, of course, they were providing shelter for Al-Qaeda. And that's why we went into Afghanistan in the first place, was to push them back so they would not have a haven, that Al-Qaeda would not, and other terrorists would not have a haven from which to operate. So theoretically, they were supposed to be our enemies, and yet we were negotiating directly with them without negotiating with the government with whom we were there. All right. So while that is going on, of course, that legitimized them by the fact we were negotiating with them. So that was, for people studying this, was a bit of a problem to begin with. But then in the middle of where they're negotiating about trying to bring the troop counts down, and one of the tricks to negotiating is that you never want to have principals there. You want to have people lower down negotiating, because then somebody higher up kind of say, oh, no, I didn't agree to that. If there's blowback or if they don't like what the deal is. One of the problems we got into with the Versailles Treaty after World War I is that Wilson insisted on being there himself, and then he was stuck with, basically he gave away everything, and it just meant he didn't have any negotiation room. His reputation was on the line. So anyway, while they are negotiating, Trump tweets that he's just going to go ahead and pull everybody out. So he pulled the rug out from under the negotiators by going ahead and making this blanket statement saying, we're just going to pull everybody out. And they're like, okay, now we got a problem in terms of negotiation because we just handed everything over to the people on the other side because now Trump has gone ahead and said this. So in February of 2020, they came up with this agreement. And the agreement was, you can look it up if you're interested in it. The agreement was really quite odd. And it required the Afghan people to do certain things and the Taliban to do certain things. And pretty quickly, that fell apart. The Taliban was not doing what it was supposed to be doing, but it also recognized that it really didn't have to because we had basically said we're going to pull the troops out. Now, this leaves Biden, when he takes office, in a terrible position because what are his options? He can either go ahead and move troops back in. Can you imagine politically trying to move troops back in to push back the Taliban, which at that point had taken over about 2/3 of Afghanistan? No, it's political suicide. But at the same time, he's got to come up with something to do over there. And by the way, he's got himself 2 other major, real big hotspots that he's inherited that, there isn't a win. There basically isn't a win. And he's got a crackerjack foreign relations team, by the way. I've been watching it really closely. And like I said, I don't always agree with them, but they know what they're doing. Mind you, I don't. I'm not a foreign affairs negotiator at all. I'm just observing here. And I'm just telling you what I'm observing. But so what it looks to me like Biden has done and why he is doing what he's doing is that he is recognizing that the real danger to America, which is what he's worried about, he is much less worried about, I shouldn't say that, but he's worried about Americans because that's what we've asked him to do. So I can stay up at night worrying about Afghan girls, and he stays up at night worrying about America, and that's the way it should be, right? I'm in the cheap seats here. But it looks to me like he has gone ahead and changed our foreign affairs in a way that looks to me really smart. And that is that our dangers have changed since we first went into Afghanistan 20 years ago. And they have changed to focus the real dangers in our society right now, in our security, America's security, our cybersecurity, overwhelmingly. Look what just happened with this pipeline over the weekend. Our cybersecurity and our disinformation. Because if you look again at what's happening in America right now, our real danger is internal. It's not external. And so what it appears to me that he has done is to focus on civil rights, on civil rights and human rights. We don't care what kind of government you live under, if it's communist or fascist or whatever, so long as you're protecting human rights. And in order to guarantee that that's going to happen, we're not going to try and put boots on the ground. We're going to use financial instruments like sanctions to go ahead and put pressure on different regimes at the same time that we go ahead and try and encourage democratic movements within countries, indigenous democratic movements like the Navalny movement in Russia. And so if you're looking at it that way, it makes sense to say to our Afghan allies, we're sorry, we've been here 20 years, you work this out, and we're not going to pull out altogether. As you know, the Secretary of State has been to Afghanistan in person to reiterate that we're not abandoning them. But rather than having boots on the ground, what the administration has done instead is to put real economic pressure on especially the leaders, the financial leaders in places like Pakistan that have been financing the Taliban. So the Taliban money comes in through other countries, and you may not have noticed this, but there's no reason you would. But one of the big announcements of sanctions was on a number of people who were believed to be laundering money for the Taliban. So I think he's basically saying we're going to try and do this with 21st century techniques, but that means that basically the Taliban, until it's weakened enough financially, is going to I won't say take over the country, but it's sure going to give the Afghan government trouble. So you asked what I worry about. That's what I worry about. And like I say, I sit in the cheap seats. So that is what it is. All right, so let me go back now to This is killing me because I can't see how anybody's reacting to any of this. And normally I actually watch this. All right, so now let's go back to some of the things that are happening that you're really concerned about. One is were a ton of questions here about, first of all, let me start with this one. A ton of questions about why isn't Matt Gaetz in jail? And the answer to that is Matt Gaetz has not been charged with anything. Now remember that there is smoke everywhere, right? Because lots of people who've been interviewed by investigators have gone talked to the media and said, hey, these are the questions they asked me. And lawyers can look at that and say, oh, well, this is what they're looking for. But right now he hasn't been charged with anything. Now let's think about what that looks like. If you are a prosecutor, you're not going to go after a sitting member of Congress, especially that visible a sitting member of Congress, unless you've got it signed, sealed, and delivered. At least that's how I would read it. You want your case to be airtight. And now we know that, I believe it is this week, that there's a deadline for one of the key figures in the case to decide whether or not he wants to cooperate with investigators or with prosecutors, and that should speed things up. If he decides he's going to cooperate, then he's going to start talking and things will move a little bit more quickly. But just because we're seeing everything in the media, it doesn't mean there's a case there. And it's a funny thing because I will not write something down in my letters unless I feel like you could make a case, a historical case for it. Not a legal case, I'm not a lawyer, but if I'm always thinking, if I were writing this in a history book, would I consider this good enough to argue it? So my standards are very different than a lawyer's standards, let me tell you, especially since my people usually are not alive to complain. But I would say that there is at least 40% of things that I think have happened that I would never put in a letter, because I feel like there's like all the pieces are there, but I haven't put them together yet in such a way that I'm convinced it's 100%. So for all that you hear stuff constantly coming, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything there that you could clink on a barrel head. And so to me, it sure looks from the stuff I read like Gaetz is in trouble, but I would never want to take that forward unless I knew I had a really airtight case against a sitting Congress critter. So that's why I think nothing has happened there yet. There isn't anything to happen yet. And they're certainly not going to put him in prison until he's charged with something, right? And not even then, actually. So that's why nothing has happened there. But I started with that to segue into people keep asking, why isn't Trump in jail? Why haven't they gone after Trump? And why haven't they gone after everybody from January 6th? And those are two separate questions. So the first one first. As you know, almost certainly, Trump is in trouble in a lot of different areas for a lot of different reasons. For finances, for the increasing amounts of information that are now coming out about the Russia investigation. And I don't know if you have followed this. I have not written about it lately because I've written about it. I wrote about it so much in the past, but I'll write about it again. You know, the whole idea that there was nothing in the Mueller report was a complete spin by Bill Barr. And it was really interesting, former Attorney General William Barr. And it was a really interesting thing, because if you actually read the documents as I did, it was really clear. I mean, it's not like there was doubt. You know, he said Mueller said right out of the bat, I'm not going to discuss whether or not Trump was involved in this because we have a policy in the Department of Justice that you can't indict a sitting president. End of discussion. And then, you know, and he said, I'm not going to answer certain questions because of that. I mean, it was all really quite clear. And now that more and more information is coming out from that investigation, as you may or may not have seen, now 2 judges have accused Bill Barr of disingenuousness, which is a fancy way to say of lying about what was in there. And there's more and more information coming out about that. But there is also quite significant information continuing to come out, and this is why the federal investigators seized Rudy Giuliani's electronics. There's increasing information coming out about the attempt to get rid of Marie Yovanovitch from who was our ambassador to Ukraine, and she was no low-level ambassador. She was one of our best and brightest, and the attempt to remove our ambassador through apparently, and again, nothing's been charged yet, apparently through Rudy Giuliani is a really interesting one because, of course, as president, Trump could have recalled her at any time. But instead, there was this weird clandestine attempt to remove her. And if you recall, she actually gets spirited out of the country on quite short notice out of concerns for her safety. So that's also out there as well. So why not? Why is he still roaming at large? Well, let me just say, if you're concerned about going after, making sure that your case against a Congress critter is firm, imagine going after a former president. It's never been done. It has never been done. So, and this is a president who has quite deliberately whipped up a large body of people who believe he is persecuted. There is huge danger in going after this man. Now, that being said, I don't think for a minute that would sway Merrick Garland, who is an absolute straight shooter. But he's never going to do it without having a really, really firm grounds on which to stand. And the same is true for all of the states that are looking at things that Trump may have done wrong, including Georgia, for example, where he clearly put pressure on Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, to go ahead and basically cheat in the election. That's a crime in Georgia, but you're not just going to throw accusations around against a former president. So that's why nothing has happened yet. A lot of people say, will it happen? I tend to think yes, but I am a prophet of the past, not of the future. I think there's a lot of other things that are perhaps more pressing. And let me get to those in just a second. So the other question in terms of criminality that you've asked about is the January 6th rioters. And someone said, why is nothing happening with them? Well, actually, lots happening with them. There have been about, I believe it's 420 arrests at this point, and indictments, some pretty serious stuff coming down for these people. And law enforcement has suggested there will be about 100 more, and that 100 more is going to include some fairly large fish. So I think that you're going to hear more and more about that. But there too, you're not going to go after the kingpins unless you've really got material on them. And personally, I have my suspicions about people who were involved, but you better have that locked up before you go public with anything like that at all. And the other piece of this that I think that I'm just going to throw out here that it's worth remembering. And actually, let me just start another topic that people asked about. And now I'm probably not going to get the name right because I'm in a hurry here. And that's actually, before I get to that, I'm gonna do one other. I'm gonna sneak something in here that actually doesn't really have to do with either of these things, but I wanted to make sure I got to it. It's Margaret, a woman named Margaret asked, my town and the communities surrounding it have help wanted signs up for jobs ranging from unskilled to skilled and well-paying. I've never seen so many in 20 years. What is going on between this disconnect between jobs that are available and the call for more unemployment benefits? Lots of people jumped on her, but I have to say, I'm guessing that Margaret comes from a small town, because this is absolutely true in my town as well. Nobody can find help, and people are desperate to get help. But let's actually unpack that a little bit. There's a bunch of things going on here, and pretty emphatically, economists say it's not that this disconnect is not because people don't want to work. It is not because there are unemployment benefits. And there's all kinds of statistics to prove that. But if you, instead of looking at the statistics, you can simply look at the major factor, which is when there is a real shortage of labor, wages go up. And right now we have not seen an increase in wages, except a very small increase in the hospitality industry, which is the one hardest hit. And the hospitality industry did add about 127,000 jobs in March. 176,000 jobs in March. But so why is there this disconnect? people have asked about, and there's a number of reasons for that. And the most important is the pandemic is not over, and if you have children, they're not vaccinated yet. So you have two issues with that. First of all, you may not want to be out in public because you don't want to expose your children to COVID. And for all that there's people and a number of people saying, oh, kids don't have a problem with it and all that, it's your kid. Lots of people are not going to take that risk. I don't think I would have taken that risk if my children were small. You make your own decisions, I guess, on that one. But to suggest that people are going to look the other way about risking their children, that's just psychologically not true at all. And secondly, many people can't get childcare because their kids are not vaccinated. At the same time, that a number of schools are not open. So, you if you have children, you really can't go back to work even if you had intended to. Another big factor in this is that hiring, especially in that level service industry job, is usually done by network. So if your uncle works in a restaurant, often you will get a job there, or your best friend. And certainly every time I've worked in a restaurant, that's exactly how I got jobs. And we used to do it. We used to move kind of as a team from one restaurant to another. One person would go and get a new job, and they'd say, hey, I really like it over here, and they'd get the rest of us to come. It's kind of fun, you kind of had a team around the town where you worked. And those networks broke down because so many places shut. But the other piece of that is when places shuttered, they did it really inefficiently. They basically just tried to hunker down as fast as they could, and they laid a bunch of people off kind of willy-nilly. And a lot of people kind of reevaluated, and they're like, why should I go back there? Especially, why should I go back to a service industry job where so many people are refusing to wear masks, and where they're really treating their waitstaff horribly. And anybody who has been on the floor of a restaurant recognizes that, I certainly loved my time as a waitress, but they're really horrible people. I mean, most people are lovely, and it was fun in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of really horrible people, and a lot of those horrible traits have gotten a lot worse in the last 4 years. And a lot of people are like, it's not worth it to me. So one of the things that people have recommended, if there are no jobs, or no apparent workers, is not to think, why won't those workers come, why don't those people want to work, but rather, why don't they want to work for me? And to try and go ahead and figure out what changes might take place in your workplace that would make it a more attractive place to be. The one thing I'd be really careful about, though, is that the talking point that the reason that people are looking or have wanted signs is because people don't want to work. That is absolutely a political stance, and it's just not true. It's just not. It is absolutely a right-wing talking point. There is a disconnect, but it's not. It's not because people don't want to work, and that's a little bit frustrating. So I did want to make sure that got out there, because you see it all the time, and I do empathize with Margaret because we have the exact same problem here. But it's not that people are saying, I'm going to choose not to work. It's that we have this real disconnect right now, in this town anyway, between how many people are available to work and the jobs, especially the seasonal jobs that are coming in here. All right, so now let me go back to what I was talking about before, and the January 6th insurrection, and what that means. So the point I wanted to make before, when I was talking about the January 6th and people who are now being accused, and so I know many of you are not following this, but there's really some of these people are just going bananas when they're hauled before a judge, because they're like, you can't do this to me. And I mean, it's really kind of astonishing stuff, because it's really clear to me as you read this that they really did believe that Trump was going to protect them, that they were above the law, that this was, you can't do this to me. I'm a veteran. And it's like, well, yeah, this is the legal system. The judge can do this to you. So that's been really interesting reading. There's a couple of places on Twitter, if you're on Twitter, where you can follow these cases, and they're kind of eye-popping. Most of them are, really. They really are eye-popping. But what the point I wanted to make about that is that these cases are going to start to go to court. And as they start to go to court, the stuff that I just told you was eye-popping is going to be in the news, including videos, really disturbing videos that are going to show on the nightly news. And so people are going to see these things. And of course, this is associated with the Republican Party. So to me, this completely begs the question that so many of you have asked: why are the lawmakers in the Republican Party doubling down on Donald Trump? Because Donald Trump lost the election. I mean, spin it however you try to. Adam Kinzinger from Illinois today said he thinks no more than about 5 members of Congress really believe Trump won. They're just saying that to attract voters. But he lost. So, like, the idea of following a president who lost an incumbent election, that's really rare, because incumbency is a huge leg up in any election, a huge leg up in any election. So he lost that, and he lost Congress at a time when the Republicans have so adjusted things in their favor that it's almost impossible for them to lose Congress as well. So why are they doubling down on this man who's got this huge cloud over him? And now we're going to have the airwaves flooded with videos and news about the insurrection. When I said there are things that I suspected but would never write about, that's one of the things that keeps me up at night, because it doesn't make political sense. It does not make political sense. But that brings up a number more of your questions, and that is that so where are we going? And now, just so you know, I'm going to be more proactive than I normally am. People are writing to me all the time saying, "What can I do? Should I be worried? Are we in danger?" And I would say yes, we are in danger, because and mind you, I've thought we were in danger for a while. But the fact that Biden won in 2020 is a respite, but it's not the end. Because the Republican Party, the current day Republican Party, and as you know, I don't believe that it's the real Republican Party. I think it's been taken over by a cabal. But that, and I've developed that in a million places, and will again if anybody wants me to. But that's not just a throwaway if you're only listening to me for the first time. They are doubling down on a lie. It's a lie. It's just there's no other word for it. It is a lie that Donald Trump won the 2020 election. It's a lie. He lost it by 7 million votes and by a significant margin in the Electoral College. And that has been, the states that he contested have been recounted. None of the votes were changed. He's lost more than 60 times in court in the attempt to change things. It is a lie that he won the election. It's a lie. And yet, the majority at this point of the lawmakers in his party are doubling down on that lie. And that right there horrifies me, because that is a party that is no longer at all concerned with governance, but simply with power. If you are willing to do anything to become powerful, nothing matters. And somebody also wrote, I've got all your questions here, I'm kind of zooming up and down them. Somebody else said, why don't they care that they're lying? And I think the best answer from that came from a theorist about authoritarian language, but also from Terry Canfield, who said, what they think is that they're lying in service to a larger good. That is, if you have to lie to the people to get them to vote for Republican, that's no problem, because it's important that you keep Republicans in office, because Republicans understand how to run the government and Democrats don't. So Republicans understand that you need to continue to support business. You need to continue to move money upward, because if you move money upward, the people at the very top are going to create more jobs and the whole country is going to do better. That's their theory. I don't adhere to that theory, and I think you can look at the fact that wealth has moved upward dramatically since 1981, and most of us have not seen that. to say that that doesn't work. And in fact, if you look at American history, the times when most Americans are doing best and when our race relations are best and when people feel like they're all moving forward together, you're looking at times when wealth is much more compressed, when there's not a huge gap between the people at the very top and the rest of us. And those times are times like the period from 1933 to 1981, when we had a period that's called the Great Compression. And interestingly enough, those are the times that most Americans who now talk about going back to the past look at and say, let's go back to those great times. Well, those were great times in part because the government regulated business so that workers actually had bargaining power, and they actually taxed the wealthy, so that under Eisenhower, for example, the top tax bracket was 91%. That's under Eisenhower, a Republican, 91%. So the Republicans are saying we got to put Republicans in office because they're the only ones who understand how the government really should work. And that is how we have gotten to the place we're at now. And I'm going to lay this out here because I'm very concerned about it. I've been watching today the debates in the Senate over Senate 1, which is the For the People Act. And that's the act designed to make it easier for people to vote and to stop partisan gerrymandering and to get big money out of government, which to me is a no-brainer no matter where you are on the spectrum. And Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, a Republican from Kentucky, has said it is his top priority for this 2-year Congress to make sure that bill does not pass. And his argument is that it takes too much power to the federal government, that states are the ones who should protect who should determine who gets to vote and who should determine their voting rights. Well, there we go back to that original point about the federal government versus the state governments. But here's what I am concerned about. If you listen to McConnell today, he said things that were absolutely incredible, like this is an attempt on the part of the Democrats to cheat and to take back, to put their thumb on the scales so the Democrats will win in the future. And the Republicans, he said, have never done such a thing. And that's why I worry, because in fact, that's exactly what the Republicans have done. You know full well that as of right before the January 6th insurrection, that about 25% of Americans called themselves Republicans. And that number, they hemorrhaged voters after January 6th, which is unusual. People don't usually leave a party immediately after an election. So now fewer than 25% of Americans believe that they are Republicans, or registered as Republicans. Lots of independents, but very few registered. And yet, what the Republicans have done is they have managed to maneuver our system in such a way that they control huge hunks of it. So, for example, let's start with voter suppression, and people have asked questions about that. And somebody said, can you please explain to me voter suppression, because so many of my Republican friends say it's just a way to keep the vote pure. Well, first of all, we don't have a problem with voter fraud in this country. There is some, very little. It so far tends to be from Republicans who are trying to prove that there is voter fraud. But that's, even still, it is infinitesimal. Fewer than 1 in a million votes in a recent study in Texas. This is not a problem. It is not changing any outcomes. But the reason it became a deal in America was in 1986, under the Republican Ronald Reagan administration. The operatives recognize that they're going to have trouble keeping the 1986 tax cuts in place in that upcoming election. And so they begin to talk about voter integrity. And literally an internal memo says, if we can toss African Americans off the voting rolls, or this should toss African Americans off the voting rolls, and then we will be able to hold on to these tax cuts and on to the majority. And I've outlined this in a number of places. Then we get, in 1993, we get the Democrats putting through the motor voter law, which tries to get more people to vote. And the Republicans instantly say, well, the only reason Democrats are winning is because they are buying votes with the Motor Voter Act, and they are enrolling illegal immigrants, as they called them, to vote under the Motor Voter Act. This was not true. This was not true. They were playing the media, and they were playing the things that people heard. So in the mid 1990s, the Republicans start to say that Republicans are losing elections only because there's voter fraud. And then, of course, there's this terrible election in 1997 in Miami in which there isn't even a Democrat running, but it's a totally corrupt election. And on the heels of that, in 1998, the Florida, I think I said Texas, it's Miami, Florida. The Florida legislature passes a law to clean up the voter rolls. And what it does is it throws more than 100,000 largely African Americans off the voting rolls in right before the 2000 election. As you know, that election comes down to Florida and a handful of votes in Miami-Dade County. When they start to do that recount by hand, the Democrat Al Gore is picking up speed way faster than he should have. Usually a hand recount changes very few votes, and this changed a lot of votes. And when that happened, we get the Brooks Brothers riot led by none other than Roger Stone coming in and stopping that recount, and then the Supreme Court going ahead and deciding that election in favor of George W. Bush. And since then, across the country, we've had more and more states enacting voter ID laws. And after the Shelby v. Holder decision of 2013, when the Supreme Court under John Roberts went ahead and found that the section of the Voting Rights Act that required the Justice Department to sign off on changes in voting laws in states that had a history of voter suppression was unconstitutional, we've had just this slew of voter ID laws. So somebody said, well, if it applies to everybody, why is it considered discriminatory? And the answer to that is it doesn't apply to everybody the way you write the laws. So, for example, the whole idea in Georgia of not being able to give water or food to somebody standing in line, well, that should apply equally, right? If that's the case for everybody, no biggie. Well, what if you are in a place where they only give you one voting machine for, tens of thousands of people? So you're going to wait in line for 6.5 hours, which was, people were waiting in line for 6.5 hours to vote in the last election. Well, that would be fair if everybody was waiting 6.5 hours, but they're not waiting 6.5 hours in white suburbs where there are lots of voting machines. So there are ways that you can manipulate voter ID in such a way that it does discriminate. So again, Texas, one of the voter IDs that they will accept in Texas is your hunting and fishing license. They won't accept a student ID. Well, right there, yes, you're making assumptions about who votes how. But generally, if you have a hunting and fishing license in Texas, it is presumed that you are going to vote Republican. And if you have a student ID, it is presumed that you're going to be voting Democratic. So if, in fact, we could come up with a national ID that went to everybody equally, then sure, throw that, and that everybody had the same access to voting machines, the exact same, sure, you throw those things in there. But that's absolutely not the way they are being enacted. And in fact, in the 1980s, when this first came up, and Democrats started to say, sure, let's have a national ID, it was Republicans who said, no, you're taking power away from the states if you start to give state IDs. Similarly, if you're using a state ID, like a driver's license, who doesn't vote? The elderly, the disabled, people in inner cities, because they're living in inner cities. And the answer to that is, well, okay, so you need to make the effort to go ahead and go to a place to get a driver's license, even if you're not actually going to drive, so that you'll be able to vote. Well, in some states, and Georgia springs to mind, they closed the registration places in primarily black areas. So you don't have a driver's license, and you can't get to a place where there's a driver's license without it costing a huge amount of money with an Uber, without it taking a lot of time. So there are ways to make voter IDs in such a way that they discriminate against one party or another. So the Republicans have done that. And then, of course, we have the issue of gerrymandering, which political gerrymandering after 2010 means that in a number of Republican-dominated states, the Democrats basically can't win. And there's a brand new study out that I was reading and will write about one of these days that said that partisan gerrymandering on the part of the Republicans has given them a 9-point advantage in the states where they have enacted gerrymandering. So the Democrats have to win by more than 9 points in order to overcome the gerrymandering that's going on. And a similar study says that when Democrats gerrymander in their states, it's not the same because they end up not getting an advantage at all. So, there's a lot of things baked into this system that say the Republicans already have a huge advantage. And to have Mitch McConnell sitting there saying, well, actually, it's the Democrats who are trying to get an advantage. To me, this is a really dangerous lie. He is lying. And when somebody looks you in the eye and lies to you, you can't work with that. That to me is, I care about democracy because I care about self-determination. When somebody refuses to give you the information you need to make good decisions about your life, there's nothing worse. There's just nothing worse. It says that you don't have the right to make your own decisions about your life. So when Mitch McConnell looks at the camera or looks at the chair and says the Democrats are the ones doing that, we call it gaslighting, but it's way worse than simply a movie. It's the destruction of our ability to have control over our own lives. And so people have asked me, am I concerned about where we are right now? Oh, yeah. When we have the entire Republican Party doubling down on this big lie, and a big lie is quite that. It's from propaganda. It's a concept from propaganda that says, you make a lie big enough and outrageous enough, and people won't believe it, and they'll start to make decisions based on it because it's so big they won't believe anybody would lie that hugely. So as I say to people as an example of this, if you have a roommate and your roommate takes $20 out of your wallet, you'll get mad at your roommate because that's conceivable to you. But if your roommate hacks into your entire family's finances and cleans out everybody's bank accounts and sells all their houses and gets them all fired from their jobs, you won't believe they could do that because you can't conceive that somebody could do that. And so you would not believe that explanation if somebody you trusted did that. So that's what we're looking at, and that's what we've got the party doing. And I am really keen on passing this For the People Act because I think unless we level the playing field again, we're going to get a Republican Party dominated by Donald Trump back in office in 2022, and I have very big, very grave concerns about what the country looks like if that happens. Mind you, this is not to say that I don't believe in there being two parties. People have asked what one could do to rebuild the Republican Party, and I would suggest that even Kinzinger and Lynn Cheney, who are doing a very good job right now of pushing back on the big lie, they are also part of that fringe Republican Party. The real Republican Party believed in a vision of the world in which we were kind of all in it together, but not kind of. We were all in it together. The government was supposed to do things for people at the bottom that they couldn't do for themselves, to give them access to resources and to education and to health care by the 20th century. So they could work hard and support the people above them, who would in turn work hard and support the people above them, who would hire people at the bottom. That's very different than where we are now, where the party is basically saying we need to support the people at the very top alone because they're the ones who know how to run society. So somebody asked me how one could rejuvenate the Republican Party. The script is all right there. I could write it for you. And sometimes I want to because I feel like we need that language, but we are not in a position where we have that right now. So people have said to me, a lot of people have asked me what they can do in this moment, and I've always shied away from that, and I will never put it in my letters. People write me angry letters saying, why don't you tell us what to do? You have to understand that when I write those letters, that's a historical record. It is not political activism, except to the degree that I want people to understand what they are making decisions about. What decisions you make is not my business. My business is trying to restore facts to our public discourse. But in this particular talk, I am going to go out on a limb and say we need to make our voices heard about the balance of this democracy, or we're going to lose it. And I'm very concerned about that. And right now, what I would love for people to do is, of course, run for office. But if you care about these things, not only talk about it on Facebook or in whatever social media you use, because as you know, I believe changing the public conversation changes the future. But to go ahead and write letters, not only to your Congress critters, and I'm going to explain some of those in a minute, but also to your local newspapers, especially if you're in small towns. And they don't have to be beautifully written or anything like that, but they do have to come from your heart, because that's how you're going to put pressure on your leaders to go ahead and to put some muscle behind the idea of returning fairness to our democracy. Now, a lot of people write to me and they say, well, it all comes down to Manchin and Sinema. And it does in many ways because of the filibuster. But I would also like to suggest that there are a number of Republicans right now who might be reachable on this issue, either because they're retiring or because they simply care about these things. So, if you're going to be writing to Chuck Grassley, good luck with that one, right? But if you are in North Carolina, Richard Burr, who used to be on the Senate Intelligence Committee and was one of the people who voted to convict Donald Trump after January 6th, is retiring. He's got nothing to lose. Letters to him would not necessarily be wasted. Similarly, Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, that's a ranked choice voting state. She is up for, these are all people who are either retiring in 2022 or up for re-election. She's up for re-election. She doesn't need the National Republican Party. She has a very strong voter base where she is. She might be willing to cross the aisle on this one. And once one of these Republicans cross the aisle, makes it way easier for Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema to vote in favor of the For the People Act and getting rid of the filibuster for it. Similarly, Patrick Toomey of Pennsylvania is retiring in 2022. He's another one who might be reachable to go ahead and protect American democracy. So I would urge you to put some muscle in this game if you care about what's going to happen, because I am very, very concerned about the Republican Party both doubling down on this lie, this lie, tying themselves to Donald Trump and that wing of the party, and having sewn up our system so thoroughly that it's very, very difficult for a Democrat to overcome. And those things to me are a really dangerous recipe for disaster. And I feel like this is the moment where we either level the playing field again, or we recognize that we're in very deep trouble indeed. Do I think we can do it? 100%. 100%. There are, as I say, only 25% of Americans even call themselves Republicans. That means 75 of them don't and want common sense legislation, not necessarily progressive legislation or conservative legislation. The vast majority of us want pretty much the same thing. But we really need to step up now and make our voices heard, because if, in fact, the Trump people lock themselves into power after 2022, we're not going to get another chance. So now is the time to put some skin in the game. And if we all do it, yeah, we can do it. So with that, I know it's a little bit more scary than normal, but I've been watching the Republican Party the last couple of weeks. I've been watching what's going on, and it's time to put shoulders to the wheel on this one, I think. Anyway, I hope that didn't horrify anyone. I can't see your comments, so I don't know. But thank you for being here. I will see you. You will see me anyway on Paper Tonight, and I will be back here on Thursday doing some kind of history. I'm open to suggestions on that. Kind of thinking about doing a survey of all of America. But let me know if you think that's a good idea or not. Anyway, thanks for being here, and I will see you tonight.